Merry meet everybody, and welcome to the Little Woman podcast. Today's comment shout-out goes to Melanie, who left this comment on my YouTube channel. As for preferring Professor Bear to Laurie, to coin a phrase, oh well duh, he was an experienced man in all the right ways without being worldly and superficial. He was a man of literature and philosophy who still practiced what Louisa May Alcott called practical philosophy in helping the weak and poor, unlike her lofty but impractical father who neglected his duty to his own family in pursuit of his own version of integrity. Jo was never going to fall in love in a romantic way with a mere unfledged boy, adopt them as brothers and sons, etc., but not love them romantically. She had to respect a man to love him, and she told Laurie as much. Friedrich had a deep personality, no surface about it. He was authentic, and authentically good, while still being unassuming, but he did have a proper, and that is to say, true self-respect. It is so obvious to me that he was everything that Jo admired and respected. It was an easy next step to love him, the more so as he loved her, while never pressuring or her presuming. I can only reiterate that I can completely understand, having been in a 40-year marriage with a man with those qualities. He's been dead almost 3 years, and I know my other half of myself is missing to this day. I understand Jo's love for such a man completely. Their partnership-style marriage as two people in complete sympathy as far as their plans for the future could mesh, their priorities about what really mattered in life was meant to be. Really, I just can't say enough about what seems so obvious to me. It really surprises and perplexes me that it's such an affront to so many, considering Louisa May Alcott's adolescent crush on Emerson and feelings about Thoreau, not to mention her love of German culture in its highest forms. How? Why would she not fall in love with Friedrich? And the only time we ever see him become vehement, if not indignant, in his dealing with another person, was in a very good cause, when he saw at the Symposium the sneering attitude of a learned man at a certain Christian tenets. He saw Jo's confusion, her puzzlement, and her unease at this attack on one of the basic foundations of her raising, granted a form of Christianity in its transcendentalist version. Professor Bear, besides arguing against this view solely on principle, seemed to know that Jo needed something, a lifeline, to keep from being drowned in soul-destroying doubt by the sophistry she was hearing. And so I applaud Professor Bear for providing one, most eloquently and with sense and conviction. I really love this podcast. I can't thank you enough for exploring this topic and the argument for her preference for Friedrich Bear. I also feel that the fact that he had 2 nephews to bring to the equation must have been a point on his favor. Jo would have been in her element, helping to raise 2 such boys. End quote. This was such a nice comment, and very fitting for this episode, for Christina and I continue to dissect the chapter Friend, which is, in my humble opinion, one of the most misadapted chapters in Little Woman films, because, for some reason, in Little Woman movies, Jo and Friedrich argue about Jo's writing when, in the book, that never happens. And it is weird that people use something against Friedrich that Louisa May Alcott never wrote. I feel really bad about Louisa May Alcott for Greta Gerwig abused her this way. And I know Barbie is a plastic doll, but I feel bad for her as well. I know lots of Little Woman fans who are Jo and Friedrich fans, and they love, love, love Little Woman. And this chapter Friend, is their favorite chapter in Little Woman, because it includes the Symposium. And this is another scene that is not adapted very often, When Jo lives in New York, she enters to Symposium with Friedrich. And in this Symposium, Jo is very eager to meet all these famous people that she has been admiring, only to see that they are just regular folks. There is a debate between some of the young philosophers, and one of these men starts to talk about atheism, and this really shatters Jo's world. Now remember, this book was written in the 19th century by Louisa May Alcott, who was a Christian. She came from Transcendentalist movement, and Transcendentalism was a Christian movement. Sometimes I like to wonder if this was something that happened to her, if she experienced something like this, that she went to a symposium and there was some young blazing atheist talking about atheist views, and then maybe Henry David Thoreau or Walter Emerson was speaking for religion. And this was something that moved Louisa. There's a moment in the book when the narrator writes that the moment when Friedrich speaks about his views and his fate, that is a moment that Jo remembered for the rest of her life, because it was such an impactful, important moment for her. So I think we can assume that this moment in the book, it does have some kind of base in reality, and it is just wonderful. And this is Little Woman Podcast. Jo and Friedrich enter the Symposium.
When I was reading about Frank Leslie's weekly illustrated newspaper, and Weekly Volcano is a caricature of this newspaper, a lot of the things that I came up with was that this newspaper, it wasn't really a newspaper but a sensational publication, and it was very popular because it liked to play with these gory details about all these murders and trials and whatnot. And then every time when there was somebody who was like a killer and his wife, and there were all these horrible details about this person, and most of the times those things were completely made up. And that's the way a lot of stories are still told today. The stories about these people, the details of what happened, they are not necessarily true. They are written for entertainment value.
Yeah, and I feel like thinking about what makes a story's sense of truth and its true emotions, true thought, something that feels, even if a story is fantastical, I was trying to be a good example, like, well, let's just say Harry Potter. Even though the world is fantastical, there is still a sense of truth in it, in the sense that we all had that feeling at some point in our lives, a feeling that we don't belong, that feeling like maybe there is something different in us. But in this world, we can find something that can make us feel like we belong. So I don't think that any sort of fantasy story or sci-fi or magical, whatever, is bad, as long as there is this sort of one true human thing that we can connect to, because that's really what fairy tales and fables go back to, is that they were to help tell a moral or help to get across this idea that would have made better sense in a fantastical way. You know, it's like how they say in musical theater, you could just say, I love you, but you can get the feeling out more through a song. Like, you can truly get the understanding of the emotions better and how you sing it, and how the music is, again, sensationalism is just, she tries to put truth in it in the sense of facts, but no heart, no characters that are likable, or but she's definitely being stifled because it's what she's being asked for, and what she knows helps to give her the money she needs to help pay for her family.
The target audience is not ideal for Jo either. It does give the impression that these stories are sold for middle class and lower class people who are not necessarily very literate. They just buy these stories for a moment of thrill, I would imagine. Like if there was some kind of a political debate or some kind of tragedy that happens, these kind of magazines would write about them in a very colorful ways to make money for themselves. She was beginning to feel rather than see this, for much describing of other people's passions and feelings set her to studying and speculating about her own, a morbid amusement in which healthy young minds do not voluntarily indulge. Wrongdoing always brings its own punishment, and when Jo most needed hers, she got it. I don't know whether the study of Shakespeare helped her to read character, or the natural instinct of a woman for what was honest, brave, and strong, but while endowing her imaginary heroes with every perfection under the sun, Jo was discovering a live hero who interested her, in spite of many human imperfections. Mr. Bear, in one of their conversations, had advised her to study simple, true, and lovely characters whenever she found them, as good training for a writer. Jo took him at his word, for she coolly turned around and studied him, a proceeding which could have much surprised him, had he known it, for the worthy professor was very humble in his own conceit. Why everybody liked him, what puzzled Jo. At first he was neither rich or great, young or handsome, in no respect what is called fascinating, imposing, or brilliant, and yet he was attractive as a genial fire, and people seemed to gather about him as naturally as about a warm hearth. He was poor, yet always appeared to give something away. A stranger, yet everyone was his friend. No longer young, not as happy-hearted as a boy, plain and odd, yet his face looked beautiful to many, and his oddities were freely forgiven for his sake. Jo often watched him, trying to discover the charm, and at last decided that it was benevolence, which worked the miracle. If he had any sorrow, it sat with its head under its wing, and he turned only his sunny side to the world. There were lines upon his forehead, but time seemed to have touched him gently, remembering how kind he was to others. The pleasant curves about his mouth were the memories of many friendly words and cheery laughs. His eyes were never cold or hard, and his big hand had a warm, strong grasp that was more expressive than words. His very clothes seemed to partake the hospitable nature of the wearer. They looked as if they were at ease, and liked to make him comfortable. His capacious waistcoat was suggestive of a large heart underneath. His rusty coat had a social air, and the baggy pockets plain and crude. The little hands often went in empty and came out full. His very boots were benevolent, and his collars never stiff and raspy like other people's. You can tell that she wanted to have his babies.
Wonderful things about it, like the pleasant curves about his mouth were memorials of many friendly words and cheery laughs. His big hand had a warm, strong grasp that was more expressive than words. It's a detail, and it just gives you this very clear picture, even though it's not like descriptive in the same way, like tall with dark hair and blue eyes and whatnot. It gives you a much better sense of who he is as a person, and that gives you a much clearer picture of who he is, and even more so how Jo sees him, which is honestly, if someone described a person to describe someone like that to me, I'd be like, wow, that's a wonderful person. It sounds like he'd be a great friend, or even like, let's just say a great boyfriend / husband. I can't imagine anybody that reads this and goes, yeah, well, Friedrich's a jerk. Or I still don't like it. How could you not like a person described that way?
Yeah, she was totally into him. This part where it says that he was attractive as a genial fire, that was always one of my favorite parts in this entire novel. When I was doing the research on the real-life Friedrichs, and I was reading this book about Charles Follen, was one of the real-life Friedrichs. He was a German immigrant, and he moved to America, and then he fell in love with Eliza, who was an American female writer. So there we have a German immigrant and an American female writer. He was friends with Louisa May Alcott's uncle, Samuel May. This part, he was attractive as a genial fire. Elisa wrote that to her journal the day she met Charles Follen. And Louisa May Alcott read her memoir about her husband when she was a teenager. So that is directly from Eliza's book. It is so funny to me because I realized that some of my favorite scenes in Little Woman are actually written by Eliza Follen about her husband. It wasn't written by Louisa May Alcott, but I think there was something about that relationship that Louisa really liked and admired. I mean, then we know how much Louisa loved Henry David Thoreau. She wrote about him in her journals also. I think they kind of intertwined because when you are a young person and you want to be in a relationship, you're in love with someone, and then you are reading this book, and there is this couple that you're shipping, just mixes together in Little Woman.
Then you take from your own life, give life to a story. And if it's something that really affects you personally, good or bad, you use it. And honestly, for me, I would try to immortalize the person I care about through my writing, because even though, let's just say, if someone's gone or will be gone, their memory is going to live on through this story. Like, oh, I just had it. It wasn't Little Women. It was a different story, whereas based on their mom or someone that they were very close to. And it was like, well, this was their chance to make it so that they lived on forever. And it just makes me happy to bittersweet thinking that, again, when you follow the idea that Jo is the avatar for Louisa May Alcott and, Friedrich is Henry David Thoreau's avatar, they get to have their happy ending, whereas Alcott couldn't have that with Thoreau. But it's just nice to know that they, in some version of life, were able to. And it just makes me sad when people don't know this part of the story and they just go, well, who cares about, Friedrich, Jo, and Louisa forever? And if you knew the backstory, you knew the purpose behind it, you would sit there and go, oh my God, like I love them.
I love this part where Friedrich gives Jo a collection of Shakespeare to help her to study character. I think it was the scarlet flycatcher in Tumble who said that people who say that Friedrich stops Jo from writing, then in the book, he gives her Shakespeare to study character. People don't read the book. That's the problem. They don't read the book, only watch the films and think that is the story.
Yeah. And again, if we're looking at Little Women as a sort of semi-biography of her life, I don't think it's that far off the possibility of it. Like some writers try to do something different and they're like, I'm not so great at that, so I'll stick with what I know. And that's fine. Stephen King writes primarily these fantastical stories. I just read a novella on Explosions Escalation, but it's not like a horror story, but it is a more fantastical kind of story. If you know that's what you're good at and you can do it, then fine. But I don't think I could really ever truly write a horror story because there are just some things that admittedly will just freak me out. And I'll stay up late having nightmares of it. I like horror movies, but there are some things I'm just like, yeah, I don't care about that because that's not my type of horror movie in the end. I just get freaked out, even just reading about certain things. Reading about Jaws, how maybe there was a murder victim in Jaws. A woman was found murdered in, I think, July or August of the year Jaws came out, and she's just been labeled as a Jane Doe many years later. Oddly enough, Stephen King's son went to a screening of the 40th anniversary of Jaws and saw a woman in the background to sort of fit the description of this Jane Doe. The filming was done around that time, and they did say, well, we did just ask random people, would you mind to be a background character for the beach? Because all you have to do is just be at the beach. I was like, I can't read any more of this at night. It will keep me up because it is just one of those like freaky coincidences. And it's not like that will keep me up. So I could never write a horror story. And again, we're looking at Little Women as being a reflection of what happened in real life, I'll take a gander and say Alcott couldn't stomach it either. And that's okay because she knew what she was good at. And some writers just make a niche of that. They know that the best of their works is fantasy, or the best that they're at is romance novels, and that's okay. There's always something that we're all going to be good at. You can't always shove your hand in the cookie jar for every type of cookie, but if you particularly are a fan of chocolate chips, then what's wrong with chocolate chips? Nothing.
It was so weird when Greta Gerwig said that we admire Jo for she doesn't want to change or grow. I never admired Jo for being immature, because I don't see her immature in the book. I admire Jo because she grew out of the immature behavior that she was having. Laurie is the immature one, even when he's in his 20s. When I was reading this book for the first time, this was the chapter when I really started to root for Jo and Friedrich, because there is this part where Jo, she starts to have these mental health problems because of these stories that she's writing. And I don't think that is mentioned in any of these Little Woman movies or adaptations. And I think that is one of the reasons why people struggle to understand this chapter, because as we discussed, she goes to this research on mentally ill people and criminals. She goes to a mental institution, does research on poisons. And I would imagine that mental asylums in the 19th century were pretty different than they are today, and they were quite horrendous places. Louisa May Alcott, she wrote thrillers, and I like some of them, but I don't think thrillers are her area of expertise. Like, I know that Agatha Christie, a writer whose books I very much enjoy, was specialized in poisons and stuff. She loved it. And she was really good at writing thrillers. But I don't think thrillers are necessary Louisa May Alcott's cup of tea. I think Louisa May Alcott was really good at writing thrillers with psychological elements, but not necessary stories that would have Mrs. Marple type of character solving a murder. Jo starts to have these mental health problems and anxiety because she goes too deep into this research.
He'll share what he truly believes in as a definite man. And so to offer his own opinion because he's too sincere and earnest to be lightly spoken like this, is not a guy that is careless with his words or speaks without a thought. Like, he is very fearful and puts much thought into what he says. And I feel like it's a little bit more admirable when you see someone who puts out an opinion or says something when they feel like it's very, even if they are kind of nervous to do so. Like, I knew someone that too, between us, she would say whatever she felt because she felt comfortable with me to say it. But with other people, particularly with the family, she wouldn't feel the most comfortable to say. And I'm like, but it's okay. You have an opinion. Yes, you would say why I don't agree with you. I think it was like, gay people deserve rights too. And I know that it took a lot of guts for her to do it, but she felt it was the right thing to do because she wasn't going to just stand there and listen to them say these very homophobic things when it's not right. Yeah, I think losing this scene is not only a shame to see, like, oh, having Jo and Friedrich spend time together, which to my knowledge so far, I think only the 2017 Masterpiece Theater version even mentions the Symposium. All the other ones do like an opera. That's funny too, because it is still something that they get to do together and have discussions of. But this, I think, a really key insight into Friedrich's character, and that is a huge loss.
Jo valued goodness highly, but she also possessed most feminine respect for intellect, and a little discovery which she made about the professor added much to her regard for him. He never spoke of himself, and no one ever knew that in his native city he had been a man much honored and esteemed for learning and integrity, till a countryman came to see him. He never spoke of himself, and in a conversation with Miss Norton divulged the pleasing fact. From her Jo learned it, and liked it all the better because Mr. Bear had never taught it. She felt proud to know that he was an honored professor in Berlin, though only a poor language master in America, and his homely, hard-working life was much beautified by the spice of romance which this discovery gave it. Another and a better gift than intellect was shown her in a most unexpected manner. Miss Norton had the entry into the Moss Society, which Jo would have had no chance of seeing but for her. The solitary woman felt an interest in the ambitious girl, and kindly conferred many favours of this sort both on Jo and the professor. She took them with her one night to a select symposium, held in honour of several celebrities. Jo went prepared to bow down and adore the mighty ones, who she had worshipped with youthful enthusiasm afar off. But her reverence for genius received a severe shock that night, and it took her some time to recover from the discovery that the great creatures were only men and women after all. Imagine her dismay on stealing a glance of timid admiration at the poet whose lines suggested an ethereal being fed on spirit, fire, and dew, to behold him devouring his supper with an ardour which flushed his intellectual countenance. Turning as from a fallen idol, she made other discoveries which rapidly dispelled her romantic illusions. The great novelist vibrated between two decanters with the regularity of a pendulum. The famous divine flirted openly with one of Madame de Staël's of the age, who looked daggers at another Corinne, who was amiably satirizing her, out-manoeuvring her in efforts to absorb the profound philosopher, who imbibed tea Johnsonianly and appeared to slumber. The loquacity of the lady rendering speech impossible. The scientific celebrities, forgetting their mollusks and glacial periods, gossiped about art while devoting themselves to oysters and ices with characteristic energy. The young musician, who was charming the city like a second Orpheus, talked horses, and the specimen of the British nobility present happened to be the most ordinary man of the party. Before the evening was half over, Jo felt so completely disillusioned that she sat down in a corner to recover herself. Mr. Bear soon joined her, looking rather out of his element, and presently several of the philosophers, each mounted on his hobby, came ambling up to hold an intellectual tournament in the recess. The conversation were miles beyond Jo's comprehension, but she enjoyed it. Though Kant and Hegel were unknown gods, subjective and objective unintelligible terms, and the only thing evolved from her inner consciousness was a bad headache after it was all over. It dawned upon her gradually that the world was being picked to pieces and put together on a new and, according to the talkers, on infinitely better principles than before, that religion was in a fair way to be reasoned into nothingness, and intellect was to be the only God. Jo knew nothing about philosophy or metaphysics of any sort, but a curious excitement, half pleasurable, half painful, came over her as she listened, with a sense of being turned adrift into time and space, like a young balloon out on a holiday. She looked around to see how the professor liked it, and found him looking at her with the grimmest expression she had ever seen him wear. He shook his head and beckoned her to come away, but she was fascinated just then by the freedom of speculative philosophy, and kept her seat, trying to find out what the wise gentleman intended to rely upon after they had annihilated all the odd beliefs. Now Mr. Bear was a diffident man, and slow to offer his own opinions, not because they were unsettled, but too sincere and earnest to be lightly spoken. As he glanced from Jo to several other young people, attracted by the brilliancy of the philosophic pyrotechnics, he knit his brows and longed to speak, fearing that some inflammable young soul would be led astray by the rockets, to find when the display was over that they had only an empty stick or a scorched hand. I know a lot of Jo and Friedrich fans whose favorite scene in the book, whose favorite Jo and Friedrich scene is the Symposium, And I think it is quite sad that it is not in any adaptation because it is such a good scene. I think it shows how Jo and Friedrich have very similar values, and this part where she describes these other guests, I think it goes very much along with this way she's now studying characters. And this scene is good too because it really shows how deeply Friedrich believes in what he believes in.
Yes, that's right. And even the discussion of women's vote was also that moment that shows that there's a little bit more than just the love of art, that they can freely, openly discuss politics and theories and philosophy, which is pretty big when you consider at the time, because I just think of another movie. It's called Giant, and it has Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, and she's like from, I can't remember exactly where, but she's more like a northerner. And she marries him, and he's from Texas. It is set in the 1920 or so. And she goes over to sit and listen into a conversation of what the men are talking about, which is like politics. And she's like, why are you stopping? Go ahead. I'm not disturbing you. This is not something that women discuss. This is men's stuff. Don't pull that on me. And listen, you knew what kind of woman you were marrying. So I'm not going to change myself because of that, because you have weird old-fashioned prejudice. And it just makes me think of that. I feel like Laurie would have been more like that. Well, that's not something that ladies talk about, but preaching is. And Fred's like, yeah, come, let's go to this symposium and talk about philosophy and talk about human rights and all these things, because I am curious to know what you think. I get it. It's one of those little details of Friedrich's character and how he views Jo is this fully fledged woman with opinions, rather than Laurie, who is just like, just be the wife I know. Don't scribble about. You don't have to think about anything. I'll take care of you like a pretty little doll. And it's a good contrast.
I think in the 1994 film, they tried to do that with conversation about transcendentalism.
Yeah, and to his defense of religion, again, like, he is not overly religious, but I like the fact that he puts up the argument for anyone that probably feels the same. I believe in religion, or someone that thinks certain things can go together. I remember reading a thing where someone was like, well, yes, I'm gay, but I'm Christian. And they're like, I hate when people try to just assume that, well, if you're gay, that must mean you're atheist, because there's a rumor saying you'll do the gays. And he's like, well, why? That's not true, but really in proper translations then say that. But why can't I be both? Why can't someone have a philosophy but still have faith and go on? I had a science teacher who was full on Italian, full on Roman Catholic. And on the first day of school, he was like, you see this? He pulled out his rosary. This is what I believe in. But once I walk into this classroom, science is what matters. He's like, I believe that it can be both. I believe in evolution by also believing in God. They're not mutually exclusive. You can believe in both, and I am open for discussion of both things. He was really cool. This was like in the 90s and was so lively. Yeah, I think that again showed a lot of Friedrich's character and his willingness to speak up and talk about how to put out the discussion for religion, because that way nobody was making the argument. It's kind of like when someone's talking smack about another person and that person isn't there to defend them, and everybody's just going to believe that person is bad. But is that really fair when that person isn't there to defend himself? I like that Friedrich is so like, I've got to give religion a fighting chance. It shows his fairness and his ability to stand his ground.
I think the narrator says that Jo had huge respect for intellect. And once again, Laurie doesn't really have that intellect to listen that Friedrich has. Jo and Laurie are not in the same level intellectually. It's not to say that Laurie isn't smart. It's just that the things that Jo is interested are not things that Laurie really cares about. Jo has intellectual craving. She wants to learn new things all the time. I have a huge respect for Friedrich here because he's basically in this room filled with atheists, and then he defends religion. I'm not a very religious person myself, but I still like this scene. When this book was written, I'd say most Americans were very religious, and it was looked down upon if you weren't. Transcendentalist philosophy came from Germany, but so did a lot of these thoughts on atheism. So it is interesting how it is this German character who defends religion. Charles Follen, the real life Friedrich that I mentioned earlier, he was a priest. He studied theology and he was a preacher. I can definitely see how we have this German, very religious man there standing up against these new ideas. I need to make a whole episode about him because he's a really interesting person. But I like the way all these real life Friedrichs, how they come alive here in this discussion and in Friedrich's character.
Yeah, and to his defense of religion again, like he is really religious, but I like the fact that he puts up the argument for anyone that probably feels the same. I believe in religion, or someone that thinks certain things can go together. Like I remember reading a thing where someone was like, well, yes, I'm gay, and I'm Christian. And they were like, I hate when people try to just assume that, well, if you're gay, that must mean you're atheist because there's a Rama gene say you'll do the gays. And he's like, well, why? That's not true. But really, in proper translations, then say that, but why can't I be both? Why can't someone have a philosophy but still have a faith and go on? I had a science teacher who was full on Italian, full on Roman Catholic. And the first day of school, he was like, you see this? He pulled out his rosary. This is what I believe in. But once I walk into this classroom, science is what matters. He's like, I believe that it can be both. I believe in evolution, but I also believe in God. They're not mutually exclusive. You can believe in both. And I am open for discussion of both things. He was really cool. This was like in the 90s and was so lively. Yeah, I think that again showed a lot of Friedrich's character and his willingness to speak up and to talk about how to put out the discussion for religion, because that way nobody was making the argument. It's kind of like when someone's talking smack about another person and that person isn't there to defend them, and everybody's just going to believe that person is bad. But is that really fair when that person isn't there to defend himself? I like that Friedrich is so like, I've got to give my religion a fighting chance. It shows his fairness and his ability to stand his ground.
I think that if there was some version that gets this the closest, I feel like that would be the 94 version, where there is more lengthy discussion of transcendentalism and Friedrich stops the men from talking to let Jo talk about what is really like for a woman wanting to vote. All these men are talking about what does a woman feel, and there's a woman right there sitting. So I feel like more versions could have a little bit more of that in their versions. And I have heard some people saying that it is difficult to adapt because they speak about religion and that is like a no topic. I'm like, well, we know that this book takes place in the 19th century. We know that Louisa May Alcott was a Christian. She was a transcendentalist. That was a Christian movement. I don't see that as a problem when we know that there's a historical context.
If somebody is a Christian, it shouldn't offend people. And even if you did it, like, let's just say a modern day, it can still work because, again, it's just the defending of religion. I didn't say specifically defending of Christianity or that Christians are better than Muslims or Jews or anything. I could see a modern Friedrich being like, why would you take away someone's faith if that is what helps them get through? Or I feel like they can work it in a way that still would feel relevant because religion still is relevant. And again, I could see Friedrich making the argument, there's nothing wrong with the involvement in the philosophy of religion, but you can't sit here and say religion is dead or you're stupid if you believe in a God, because there are many things that happen in this world that we didn't think could happen. let's just say internet didn't exist during the time of the book, internet would have been seen as silly and beyond ridiculous. Again, I could say you're genuinely thinking of a way in a modern perspective. Friedrich could still make that argument and still feel very genuine and very modern, because it is ultimately what he's defending is the people, or the people's right to believe in what they want to believe. And they're not stupid of wanting to believe in a higher something.
It takes a lot of guts to speak your mind in this kind of situation where these young men, they seem quite hostile. And the narrator says that the atmosphere was very exciting and intense. I can imagine that some of these young men want to fight and argue, to get physical, so it takes a lot of guts to speak your mind. Thank you so much for listening. Christina and I continue our chat next time. Take care and make good choices. Bye.